And we're online. Okay, with me today is Dr. Tom Thompson, or if you prefer, Dr. Mr. Dungeon Matron. Hi, Tom. Thanks for being here again.
Sure, no problem at all.
So, hi, Charlene, and hi, Miyagid. I hope you're all doing great. So, Tom, what do you say? Maybe a quick recap about yourself, and then we can start talking Dark Ages.
Sure. Well, obviously, again, most importantly, I'm Dungeon Matron's husband. But I guess started reading history when I was about five. I think literally the first thing that I remember reading is a story about Native Americans. So anyway, I went to school in England for a while. I have a doctorate in history. My particular field is colonial and early national America, but I have a sort of a minor field in British history. Uh, but I'll read pretty much anything. And one of the reasons for that is it's great to compare and contrast, to draw the analogies. And it makes visiting places a whole lot more fun.
Oh, for sure. Okay, I see Campaign Train has joined us in the chat as well. Hi, Cross. And if anyone has any questions for Tom over the course of the stream, please drop them in the chat and I'll get them to him. Okay, so we're going back to the Dark Ages and had a quick question to begin with. When and where do you place the Dark Ages? Because, they're not something that happened all over the world. It was pretty localized, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense that's sort of the key to this discussion, which is what the hell are these things?
Mm-hmm.
Because the definition is so loose. It can mean a variety of things, and probably what most people immediately turn to is some part of the Middle Ages, which means it's a European thing. If you look closer at it, it's probably a Western and partly Central European thing. Uh, but the actual sort of phrase Dark Ages goes back to probably the 1330s, which is a long time ago. But it means that when Petrarch, the Italian poet, was discussing these things, he actually identified himself as living in the Dark Ages. Um,
Right.
and in his view, it was it
Elisa.
was uh-oh. In his view, it was anything that had happened since the fall of the Roman Empire. And this sort of idea that there was dark ages after the, sort of the glories of classical civilization. That was the original thing. And this was later taken up by Renaissance scholars. I mean, arguably, of course, Petrarch is essentially the beginning of the Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
People like Giordano Bruno or people like that actually started to think about history as a discipline. They started to define it. So the Dark Ages was 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 really the period between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, and that's sort of where the whole story starts. And then it started to change. So I think everybody has some kind of a concept um, about it, but that is sort of the totality of it. And since then, we've been shaving little bits off of it. So, for example, um, people realized fairly early on that the Renaissance began at different places at different times. So, whereas in 1350 you could be in northern Italy and saying things like, "Oh, thank God the Renaissance is here, my life will get better." But if you're north of the Alps, you're still stuck in the shitty Middle Ages, you know. So the whole idea of a dark age, in terms of when it ends, certainly that just changes. It just really depends on where you are, exactly as the definition of the Renaissance changed.
Fair enough, yes.
Um, so there you go. That's pretty much how it started.
Okay, quick question. Going back, you mentioned Petrarch saying, hey, these are the Dark Ages and whatever. How much was that actually? Things are terrible now, and they were so much better way back then, versus oh, things were better in this ancient time that I don't actually remember because I was not alive at the time, but everyone says it was great.
Yeah, I mean that's really what Petrarch is saying. I live in really, really crappy times, and things were so much better 1,000 years ago under the Romans. And it isn't really until again later in the Renaissance when scholars start to say, "Oh wait, hey, we rediscovered classical civilization," that they come up with the formulation that there's classical civilization, then there's the Middle Ages, and then there's the Renaissance. Right? You can't
Hmm.
have a rebirth without a birth, obviously.
Of course, yeah.
Um, but at best, the Middle Ages, define them however you will, is just that period of time where apparently nothing exciting or good happened. So it's kind of, I'm going to use a ridiculous word. It's schismogenesis, which
Okay,
is
which
to
means
say you're defining yourself in opposition to others.
okay.
So an example of that would be that it used to be thought that English nationalism arose as a reaction to all the dynastic wars with the French. So, we don't really know what we are, but we're not French. Um, which, depending on who you are, is very attractive. But at the same time, I mean, it just doesn't hold water because if you look at, let's say, the two kings that are usually put forward as supporting the use of English as a language in government, in courts, that kind of thing, which would be Edward III and Henry V. They claimed to be the king of France. They married French princesses. They wanted to conquer all of France. So, how English is that? I think the answer ultimately is there's nostalgia, and that's really what Petrarch has. And then somebody grabbed the idea and made it into a system, and that's why when you say Dark Ages today, people still think the general population still thinks of this sort of benighted, uncivilized period.
Okay, so we're saying between the fall of Rome and whichever Renaissance happened to be going on wherever you were, and I
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
and I was going to say also anywhere where the Western Roman Empire had been geographically, right? Because I don't think since the East went from the Byzantines to the Ottomans like pretty much overnight. I don't guess there was that kind of period of dark aginess kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the problems of using this as periodization, which is that technically, although the Byzantines had been declining for a long time, the final break that comes in 1453 when the Ottomans take
Hmm.
Constantinople. By that time, of course, you've already had at least 100 years of the Renaissance in Italy.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, good point.
so yeah, so you kind of have to shift and get. That's why I said at the beginning, Western and Central Europe, because the way you end up hedging on the Dark Ages thing is, well, okay, you can't talk about the Byzantines, and you can't even talk about, for example, things like Charlemagne,
Hmm.
because it doesn't prove your point, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, if
Um,
you look at the Carolingian Empire, basically that's kind of disproving the whole benighted and illiterate and crazy stuff. Yeah.
yeah, no, and that's exactly right. It, they're not. I mean, the Carolingian Empire is obviously the best example, but there are lots of others. I mean, why did William the Bastard want to become king of England? He didn't want to become the king of England because of the fish and chips. Wanted to go to England. He wanted to take it because England was at that time probably the best run kingdom in Western Europe.
Is that so?
It was administratively sophisticated. It was wealthy. Why do you think the Vikings kept going after it? Because it was wealthy. Um, and in fact, it was out there on the edge. You would think that would be sort of,
I-
if you could look for a dark age society, it would be something out on the edge, something out on the periphery,
Which is
right?
always the case in any period of time you're looking at. Yeah, it's like the
Yeah,
fringes would be the least advanced. Yeah.
That's what you would think. I mean, and not that you can't go beyond England and go into Scotland or Ireland, but at the same time, it's pretty much out there from the traditional Mediterranean center of Europe. Um, but it's a well-run, prosperous, sophisticated, stable kingdom. Well, that's not very dark agey, so you just ignore it. Well, and even the Carolingians, if you think about it, usually if somebody brings up the Carolingians and talking about the
Hmm?
Dark Ages, the answer is, oh, after Charles the Great, they fell into civil war. It just all fell apart. And it's like, well, that is correct. They fell into civil war, but somehow after almost a century of civil war, the idea of East and West Francia was strong enough so that they reconstituted themselves, eventually became Germany and France, and are the basis of the center of Europe today.
Hmm. Yeah.
So it isn't like it just disintegrated.
Oh yeah, for sure. Okay, so what's the main let's call it the main academic thing about the Dark Ages right now?
So as I said, you start with the idea that it's basically the Middle Ages, and that's a pretty wide popular belief.
Hmm.
Um, but almost immediately, I mean, scholars aren't stupid. They figured out that you have to start sort of carving that away. So they realized that the Dark Ages mostly are, in terms of scope, are geographically limited. Um, they realized that uh, it probably isn't safe to say from the fall of Rome, because again, that implies that suddenly in 476 it went from the glories of classical civilization into a dark age. And of course, it doesn't work like that at all. For a
Yeah.
century after the the disappearance of the last Roman emperor in the West, the so-called barbarian kingdoms are still using Roman bureaucracy, especially tax collecting units, because everybody wants money. Um, it's a very slow decline,
Yeah,
even in the West.
I can imagine it. But correct me if I'm wrong. Some of the barbarian kingdoms were already in place when Rome, let's call it officially, fell. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
So
absolutely. I mean,
again, there's an
the
overlap there
Frank.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Franks. First of all, again, there tends to be this sort of impression that it fell and then all of these barbarians flooded in, but that's not true. Most of them are already in the empire. Most of them are what's called the federati. Most of
Mhm.
them are settled inside the official Roman boundaries. They've been interacting with the Romans and with Roman bureaucracy for centuries. And so they understand how this works. This is nothing new to them, and they co-opt pieces of the Roman structure as it fits, uh, their circumstance. So
Yeah.
an awful lot of this goes on for at least, I guess you would have to say at least a century. But basically, the reason it eventually all falls apart is that the economy falls apart. The Western Empire ceases to be an empire of cities, so that the whole basis of the economy changes, and the Roman structures that were based on that wither away,
Hmm.
and now you're into what you could, I suppose, legitimately call a Dark Ages, in the sense that things become localized as opposed to imperial
I
or
got you.
bigger.
All right. Okay.
But just to make the point, again, that happens at different times in different places. So you can't say the Dark Ages begins like that.
Okay. So it's a very, the only thing we can say about it is that it's very loosely defined and placed as a term, the Dark Ages.
Yeah, and nobody really knows when it ends either. So that's the other thing. So really, the original thought was literally 476 to 1350, I suppose. And then it started getting smaller and smaller and smaller. That period after the fall of Rome is now generally referred to as late antiquity, because it's now recognized that there were a lot of holdovers.
Mhm.
So, and again, you have these sort of periodic sort of pop-ups, whether it's the Carolingian period or the 12th century Renaissance or something like that. So for Dark Ages, there are at least people out there with flashlights looking around. It's not totally dark.
That's an interesting way of putting it. So you mentioned earlier, it's like one of the things people used to define the Dark Ages was like this vast stretch of time when nothing progressed, nothing new happened, and stuff like that. So uh, could you talk about a few things that came out of that period, just to give some examples?
Sure. One of them is our current writing system, which is largely based on Carolingian minuscule. So this is a script that was developed at the court of Charlemagne. I don't think we know who actually developed it, if it was one man, but he again, you're talking about a very complex structure in the Carolingian Empire. He had brought over scholars, he brought over Alcuin of York from England to sort of head it all up. But Charlemagne has to somehow communicate with people on the other side of the Pyrenees going south, and people on the other side of the Elbe going east, and everything in between. So this script is largely designed so that it is easily readable. It's not so ornate
Hmm.
that it doesn't look like an illuminated manuscript.
So it's also easy to copy.
Exactly.
All
It's
right,
easy
yeah.
to copy. If somebody has an accident on the road, if one of the messengers has an accident on the road, it's quite possible that because this is a standardized script, that when he gets to wherever he's supposed to go, the person at the other end can figure out what it says. And so, that's one of the things that I think kind of gets overlooked in a way, because Carolingian minuscule has basically been used continuously since that time. I think that's actually the greatest thing that he did, other than sort of the general concept of Europe, I suppose we should say. That's a very vague concept, and it can be used by various people in various ways.
As it has been, yeah.
But yeah, remember, probably 40% of Charlemagne's empire was or contained areas that the Roman Empire never contained. So, in the sense of spreading, quote, civilization, that's a pretty, he moved east. That's a pretty big deal, especially if the whole point of saying that it's the Dark Ages is civilization. There isn't any. But he's spreading it. So, obviously that doesn't work. So you have to ignore that too.
Ah, okay, we've got campaign terrain going, not so much so anyone can understand it, as so no one can't understand it.
Right.
Sorry,
And it's
can't
absolutely right.
misunderstand it, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that you're right. You're absolutely right. One of the things is when you have an empire that stretches for over 1,000 miles. Yeah,
You need
it's
standardization, yeah.
it's easy for the local guy to go, "Oh, I didn't get the memo," or I got it, but a horse had slobbered on it or something. Um, but yeah, one of the things obviously that Charlemagne does is he sends out, well, they're what become counts, but they're inspectors. They're what under Louis XIV and in the rest of the Ancien regime were called intendants. They go out, they inspect. What are your concerns? How are things going? It's practically a recognizably modern sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
And if you're on one side of the empire and the accounts are written like this, and then tomorrow you go to the other side of the empire and the accounts are written another way, then you're not going to be able to do a very good job, are you?
No, no, not at all. The other thing that is interesting about that system is that Charlemagne had no problem with moving local administrators, so that if well, it's not an account, it's a comité. But anyway, if the dude went out and said, "Hey, this guy's having trouble," he could report back to Charlemagne and say, "He's not very good at this, this, and this," or it could just be as simple as, because in a society like this, this can be a problem. He's making alliances with the local elite, and I think they're going to rebel, or they could rebel. Charlemagne would move administrators from place to place as well, based on these reports. So, it's a staggeringly modern way of doing things in a non-modern, a pre-modern environment.
Yeah, this is one of the things I love about history because you keep getting these patterns solving the same problems with whatever is available at that time. And even if today would do it a bit differently, maybe it's there's always this recognizable pattern. I always find that
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. People don't really change, and issues and problems come up over and over again, and different societies come up with different ways to deal with them, or not. And so, some to be able to look over 1,000 years into the past and go, "Oh, hey, that's exactly what my company does," is pretty amazing.
So let's see here. Hi Sean, hi Dungeon Minister. And yeah, Dungeon Matron is saying Charlemagne had a contest for best script. Winner gets the plague for free.
Actually, this is a relatively plague-free period.
Is it?
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, assuming you mean the Black Death.
Uh, let's say the Blood Plague. Yeah. How's
Yeah,
that?
because we now know that the plague of Justinian in the 6th century was the Black Death.
Hmm?
I mean, it was bubonic plague, right? Um, and it did come back, just like the medieval Black Death. It did come back at intervals thereafter, but after about 600, it disappeared again for a while, for a long time, and you don't see it again, until the 1340s,
Is that
roughly.
is that
But
because
that's
of?
but that's not to say there aren't other plagues going on.
Oh yeah, I imagine. But was that
Yeah.
because of the less there were smaller population densities and stuff like that, or climate conditions? What?
I guess the standard, and this is the last 20 years, is that plague outbreaks, the origins of plague outbreaks are in Central Asia, and they deal with a certain rodent in Central Asia. And when that rodent is struck by a virulent outbreak of the plague,
Hmm.
it gradually spreads, and it can go in any direction, basically, except north. It doesn't go into the Arctic, obviously. But for whatever reason, between about 600 and again about 1340, there wasn't at least enough of a catastrophic change in the climate to encourage overpopulation of whatever the little marmot or whatever the hell it is
All
in
right.
Central Asia to start this kind of thing up. So, that you're right, the plague of Justinian and things like that did a couple of things. It's not just population density, it's also the decline of the economy,
How's that?
because people aren't traveling as far.
Oh,
Because the
okay. All
economy
right.
is moving from an urban-based economy to a rural-based economy, you don't have two things. If you don't have cities, you're missing two things. One is, as you say, population density. That's a great place for a plague to hit. All the people are, close together. It's super fun feeding time. But also, it means that you don't have merchants uh, traveling as much
And
from
carrying
city to
carrying the
city.
plague from place to place. Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, it's generally speaking, it's the population density, but what's behind that as well is this ultimate change in the economy, which, as I said, with late antiquity and bureaucracy and tax collecting, it all goes hand in hand, because if you can only collect taxes in the way that the Roman Empire collected taxes if you have a monetary economy. But the reason
Okay.
that you have a monetary economy is that you have this mercantile web where the transactions are so numerous and so complex that you need money.
Yeah, because you just can't keep bartering all the way because of the volume of stuff going through, yeah? Yeah,
Exactly.
all right.
Absolutely right. It's great, but it's great that you own all these cattle. Okay, what are you going to do with them? How much are they worth? That's meaningless in an economy in 800. They're not worth anything in a monetary sense. So all of these things work together gradually to sort of wear down the structure of the Roman Empire. But it took a lot longer than people used to think.
Yeah, it's definitely something that happens over the course of 20, 30 years. I think it's even more than a generation or three, maybe. Yeah.
And it's again, it depends on where you are. If you're in, uh, it never really happened in much of northern Italy.
Okay.
Okay, but on the other hand, of course, if you're in let's say northern France or what became northern France, there it starts to devolve very quickly.
I would imagine
And of
that.
course, it was never there in what became Germany.
I guess I understand. It's like the places that were either out just on the borders or that had never fully assimilated went back quicker. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. There
so,
aren't that many of them. It's not a dense web. So for example, if you look at the Roman settlements along the Rhine,
mhm.
those are primarily military establishments, right? Their actual existence, their building and their existence is financed by the Roman state. Well, there's one where, okay, the Roman state went away, so those start to decline immediately. The barbarians, which that were on both sides of the border, now just don't pay any attention to the border, so they don't really perform any function anymore, and they're not getting support from the Roman state, so they just wither away almost immediately.
So that would kind of be like the closest analogy I can think is a mining town where the mine has closed down or run out. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, exactly. The load is exhausted, basically, and as a result, everybody leaves town. And it's the same thing in the Roman outposts on the Rhine. You know, the Roman Empire, the Roman government is not paying for anything, so the army just packs up whatever's left of the army, packs up and goes home. Remember, at this point, at least half, if not three-quarters of the army isn't even Roman. It's essentially the same barbarians that they're supposed to be guarding against. Um, and all the people that are there, it's a service economy for the Roman garrisons. No Roman garrison, no service economy. The merchants have to pack up and go somewhere else. So those kinds of territories just almost immediately die out.
Okay, I had a question about Northern Africa because there were some cities there which were apart from Egypt. I mean, you've got places like Leptis, Mania, and other cities like that which were, I think, population-wise, they were not as large as Rome, maybe, but way up there. Do we have some kind of North African Dark Ages as well? Or is that something completely outside of your area of expertise?
It actually survives better than most. Let's
Seriously?
put it that way.
Right?
Yeah, yeah. And there's a couple of reasons for that. It's tempting to, again, you go back to the old barbarian invasions thing. Well, the Vandals get to North Africa,
Hmm.
but there aren't that many Vandals. They're not a huge number of people. They don't move in and displace the people already living there. So when they take over, Carthage and the coastal strip, they're a ruling aristocracy, but they are not probably more than like 10% of the population, maybe 15%. And then, of course, Justinian comes along and kicks them out. So there's sort of less destruction there in a way.
Okay.
The other thing is, remember that at this point, again, climate being what it is, North Africa Egypt too, but North Africa is also one of the granaries
Of course, I mean that's where
of the
yeah,
the Roman Empire generally, but the Byzantines
yeah,
certainly. That's one of the reasons. And if you think about it, Justinian goes after North Africa before he goes after Italy
yeah,
because he needs what North Africa provides.
which is basically the grain and the food supplies. Yeah,
Exactly, exactly. Well, if it doesn't exist, if it's already gone to hell, he's not going to go for
yeah, good point.
it. So I think they survive pretty well, and I mean, uh, they do get drier um, over time, but you know uh, when Islam sweeps over North Africa, remember it's always been just a coastal strip. It's not like it goes very far inland.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's pretty attenuated. It's not like you can fall back strategically, you know. Um, so it just gets overrun uh, by the Islamic armies, you know, in the 700s, early 700s, and it kind of life goes on as usual, really. You know, it never really has that deep dark age that a lot of Western had.
I get you. So you've got again Roman Empire goes bye-bye. You still got the Vandals who are running things for a little bit. Then you've got the Byzantines, and then you've got the I always forget. Is that the Fatimids or the Abbasids? I keep forgetting. But
I think is it the Abbasids? The Fatimids are later.
all right, yeah.
Yeah, but whatever. Whoever the caliph is at that point in time.
But
Yeah.
there was always someone in charge of the
There was
overall
always
area.
somebody
Yeah,
there, and every one of them understands that you don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg. You know, it's one thing. It's one thing to go in and take I don't know some stretch of relatively heavily forested land in Central Europe. There's nothing there. You're going to have to develop it. You're going to have to put some work into it. It's much easier for the Vandals to walk into Carthage and say, everything is going to be the same except for two things. One is we're going to encourage you not to be Christian. Sorry. We're going to encourage you to be Arian Catholics, but not Trinitarian Catholics. And secondly, you just pay your taxes to us. Otherwise, you got to worry about it.
yeah.
And everybody's like, well, that's not a lot, you know.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
compared to what could happen, you know. So yes, just successive overlords coming in and going, yep, you're doing fine. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's why we're interested in you in the first place.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because one of the Dark Age tropes is, swarms of big buff guys in loincloths and clubs just, roving around and beating up everyone, which,
Well, that's where the term vandal comes from, is it? And it's kind of ironic because really what they are very concerned to maintain certain structures. You know, they are not going around just leveling, everything they can find. They're like, no, you're a tax collector. That's fine. You sit there, you collect it, you forward it to the same address. It's just now I'm living there.
yeah, I think we've got the same thing with Goths because again, same connotations today, but they really did build up a few places back then.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. Again, this is one of those things where the whole Dark Ages doesn't really work because again, the starting point is, oh, it was great in the old days and then it all became crap. Okay. But again, it's only the Western Roman Empire. But if you're on Malta, you know that there's to go from North Africa, to go from, Tunis or something
Hmm.
like that, to Malta, to Sicily, to Italy, you're talking about the heart of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Sicily was the granary of the empire long before Egypt was, or Egypt and North Africa. And the idea that, oh, that doesn't work because they continue to do what they were doing, I think really cuts at the whole Dark Ages argument. I mean, personally, if this hasn't become clear yet, I don't really believe in the Dark Ages. So when you start qualifying it as much as you have to qualify it, is it useful as a term? No.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I find even Middle Ages can be a bit soft around the edges, if that makes sense. Dark
Mm-hmm.
Age, Dark
Yeah.
Ages is definitely way out there. But what
Well,
what
I guess Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and the upshot of that is that today, at the end of a long process, as people carved away at the Dark Ages, is that it's much more likely. Let's say the period from 550
Hmm.
to we'll say the year 1000 is now just referred to, or yeah, we'll say 1000. It's generally referred to by historians just in the most neutral way possible. It's not a dark age. It's the early Middle Ages. That's all we're going to say about it. We're not going to, use some kind of weird pejorative term, um, because they realized at some point they hit critical mass and they had carved away at it so much that it wasn't really even there anymore. It's like a sculptor with a block of marble going, somewhere inside of this is a tremendous work of art, and I just need to reveal it. And then, 2 weeks later, his final tap, and he realizes he's reduced it all to a pile of shards, and there's nothing in there. There's
Yeah.
just nothing.
That's an interesting way of putting it.
Well, periodization is a real issue because for two reasons. One is, like most things where there's a shorthand term
Mhm.
for a process or something like that, uh, that label tends to outlive the process itself. So it's a handy way of referring to something, uh, and yet that thing may have moved on in the time since that label was first applied to it.
I think I get what you mean. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, we do this all the time. Um, I can't really think of another example at the moment, uh, but yeah, I mean, we even the term Middle Ages obviously is questionable because again, that's Italian historians in the 15th and 16th century saying, "Oh wait, there's this long period in between, whether it's good or bad, it doesn't really matter. But now there's a new age."
No,
So they're engaging in schismogenesis, basically. They're
okay.
saying, no, there's classical civilization, there's this middle period where there isn't any civilization, and now there's us, and we are the rebirth of classical civilization. Well, okay, but you're Italian, you're thinking about Italy, and at the very time that you're saying this, it's pretty much business as usual in a medieval way in most of the rest of Europe.
Okay. So let's see here. Le Guin is saying, I always feel Dark Age invasion is more just a change of management with the occasional supranational slash intergovernmental meddling. Pretty much.
Again, that's certainly like we were saying in North Africa. That's pretty much almost exactly the way it works. It's like exchange one set of overlords for another. You know, it's like draw a card. Who's got the card that says we rule today? Um, but uh, there are other places where you can't really call it an invasion. I think genetic studies recently in looking at the so-called Viking invasions in England and Scotland determined that actually the amount of Scandinavian DNA is just staggeringly small. The exceptions are places like the Shetlands and the Orkneys that are way off on the edge. It was a small population to begin with, and there's a whole lot more typically Norse genetic material. But even in the areas in England, like that we have traditionally called the Danelaw, where there are linguistic and architectural remnants of the period when the Danes and the Norwegians essentially ruled the area. The actual genetic makeup is not overwhelmingly Scandinavian or even Scandinavian. So it doesn't seem like there was a huge movement. We used to think there was a huge movement, sort of like the Angles and Saxons coming into England, but that
Okay.
seems to have gone by the wayside. That's one of the things that genetics can do for you is it can say, look, there's a difference between an invasion
Mhm.
and a coup, which you could argue, like the Vandals in North Africa, were essentially a coup, except that they did bring their wives and children with them. It's just there weren't very many. But then there are other ones where it's just like, hey, we're just kind of moving around, seeing what we can do. Nobody's doing this piece of land, so I'm going to take it. It's not a directed thing necessarily.
Yeah. Okay, the Dungeon Minister is saying all history is contemporary history. Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Putting
And
divisions
have now
just
without
confuses
then.
things.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and Lugun is saying, I think Dark Age communities were far more connected than we traditionally expect, with trading and cultural drift. Hmm.
I can't remember the guy's name. There was a study done on, somebody found a notebook, basically. And this was word, not a wool merchant, but like this sounds terrible. A wool procurer. What I guess what you would have called a factor. Okay. And this was the guy who not wandered. He went throughout the countryside buying up next year's wool.
So kind of wool futures kind of thing?
Yes, exactly.
All right.
Yeah. So this is in the 14th century in England. And he traveled the countryside and he kept track of all of his transactions in this book, which somehow survived. And in that, what you see is that he's not going and buying wool that already exists. They are exactly as you say, wool futures. Okay. And he will, even in certain cases, if it's a proven customer, pay the guy now for next year's wool.
Okay.
Or pay half or something. But he has this huge route throughout, I think it's in East Anglia, where he's talking to hundreds of people who have sheep and buying their wool futures. That in itself would be pretty wild. Okay. He also works through merchants in the on the East Anglian coast, mostly Norfolk. Through them, he's in contact with merchants in the Low Countries as well.
Okay.
So there is, and he's not particularly wealthy or anything. He's not a big merchant. He doesn't become, Lord Mayor of London or something like that. He's just a guy who goes out and works. He's sort of a reverse traveling salesman in a way. But his actual contacts span hundreds and hundreds of miles, hundreds and hundreds of people. I think they figured out that he did actually manage to get home at time and had like 6 kids or something. But to your point about the connectivity, he records things like was in this particular village outside of, I don't know, Framlingham or something like this. And so told me that his brother-in-law in name another village, is going the sheep route, so to speak, and I should go talk to him. So he goes there, and from there he gets more leads. And the result is that all of these villages are connected by this one guy and by other things, obviously. Not like he's the only thing. So you're absolutely right. I think they're much more connected. We just don't see it. And that leads me to something that I guess I kind of want to talk about. The fact that this book survived is a miracle. And the simple fact is that historians and archaeologists really like to have writing.
Okay.
And that writing can be in the form of a book or a scroll. It can be an inscription on a pottery shard. It can be carved on a wall. It can be, graffiti in Pompeii. It really doesn't matter. Everybody feels more comfortable if they have writing to back it up. And so one of the one of the reasons that historians at first sort of tried to go along with the whole Dark Age characterization
Mhm.
is because they focused on things like two things. They're kind of flip, two sides of the same coin. One is literacy, and the other is how much writing has survived. Because could argue, look, that's the best evidence there is for what's going on. So the fact that this Chapman's book, Chapman is a traitor, that it survived is both extremely fortuitous and just because of the fact that it survived, it skews our view of what was going on because there's no alternative writing to look at. Okay, it's the only piece of evidence for this. So it may actually be that there's more than this guy running around, and of course we tend to think there is, or it could be this guy was just a genius. Okay, but we don't know. But historians and scholars largely think of this as a dark age, if they think of it as a dark age, because of the lack of writing. Archaeologists, yes, they have other things to work from. But there are historians who have read literally every piece of Dark Age writing, everything that survived, because that's how little has survived.
Oh, well, all right.
So we tend to over rely on that. We tend to say, oh, this is the only evidence we have, so this is what we've got to go with, which is fine, but you need to think about what it is that you're not getting as well. I mean, as I'm sure everybody knows, the vast majority of writings from this period are written by members of the church, i.e., a vested interest. No, actually, kind of an invested interest. Haha. Sorry. So you're looking at an immediately biased. Whether it's true or not, it's biased. Okay, and this becomes a real problem because that's what we have to rely on. That's where we get the picture from. As an example, to go totally out of this particular time frame, when they went into King Tut's tomb in 1922, this was done by archaeologists, and they were quite rightfully very excited about finding an intact tomb. Nobody had ever found one before. So nobody knew exactly how the pharaohs were buried, right? So this is worth it on its own, right? But one of the things that everybody forgets because they just, see picture after picture of the mask is that they were also looking for writing. Because at the time that they went in, nobody knew who King Tut was. There were several different theories, but nobody was sure what his connection was to the previous pharaoh. They knew where he fit on the list of kings, but they didn't know about relationships or anything like that. And they got very excited when they got into the tomb, and they found what seemed to be a very large pile of rolled up papyrus. Very excited. They went past gold stuff to get to it. And unfortunately, when they took a closer look at it, they realized it was essentially discarded linen shrouds.
Oh.
And so there was no writing. So nobody knew. So at that point, again, if you're not, if you haven't read much about ancient Egypt, as it turns out, because we've now had 100 more years to gather more data, his father was the somewhat infamous Akhenaten, who was essentially a monotheist, the first monotheist in Egypt. And after Akhenaten died, the priests of Amun reasserted their control over the bureaucratic apparatus and basically erased him. and King Tut was his son. And in fact, King Tut's the name we know him by mostly, the Tutankhamun, was originally Tutankhaton, but he changed his name because the Aton was the sun disk that his father, the great heretic, had wanted everybody to worship. So he reverted to the traditional. But nobody knew this at the time, in 1922. But they wanted that writing because everybody feels more comfortable with that as of evidence. But I will point out that even though at that point nobody knew who King Tut was really, nobody calls the Egyptian New Kingdom a Dark Age. We didn't know how these people related. There were lots of guesses, but we didn't know where they were buried. We didn't know where they lived. We didn't know who their children were in lots of cases. We didn't know. Seriously, you don't even know. I mean, like today, if you look at a Western European royal family, you can take them pretty much all the way back, at least to Charlemagne, if not before. But not total ignorance, but total confusion about this kind of thing in the Egyptian New Kingdom. But nobody calls the New Kingdom a Dark Age. So I think that emphasizes the fact that this was largely an attempt by early historians to say, look how great we are. We have revived classical civilization. Somebody needs to give us a gold star.
Yeah, and in order to make it look better, they just had to make the previous period look worse, yeah?
Even worse. That's right. No, I don't know. Maybe they were up for tenure at the university, but but anyway, that's one of the reasons why I really don't believe in the idea of a dark age. I mean, there's a Greek dark age. There's this period between the Bronze Age collapse and the rise of archaic Greece. It's also called the Greek Dark Age. And the reason the scholars do that is because literacy was lost. You go from the linear B script of the Bronze Age, you go through 400 years of nothing, where it's apparent where literacy just apparently disappears in Greece. And then at the beginning of the archaic period, you get to this Phoenician-inspired alphabet that is the beginning of the one that we identify today. So that has to be a dark age as well, because there's nothing to read. Was it really a dark age? I don't know. If you ask the people living then, maybe they didn't think so.
Yeah, I mean, the Bronze Age collapse is also another event in history that I find very fascinating, and partly that's because of that blackout of information right behind it.
Mm-hmm. But again, I mean, there's an awful lot of stuff that's available for that period that is called the Dark Ages in Western Europe. There's an awful lot that's available. So it's sort of hard to go with the, oh, we have nothing to go on. It's clearly, culturally bankrupt kind of thing. I just find it's a misnomer, and everybody, especially in the popular imagination, now thinks that all these people who lived back then were just peasants dying at 22, and that's it.
And living in mud huts and which is another thing. I mean, because I think you've got the the cathedral building and stuff like that is happening at that point in time.
Well, and it's also funny because again, you tend to emphasize certain things. So Gothic as an architectural style starts in the 12th century, right? But it's not like there was nothing there before.
Yeah, exactly.
And the strange thing about it is that, for instance, St. Paul's in London, there's the new St. Paul's, which is an English Baroque, structure. Old St. Paul's, which is a medieval structure, and there was a very large Saxon church there before that. But it's so buried under everything that you can't get to any remnants of it. It's just not there. So the perception is, oh no, even the medieval thing was which was crappy compared to what we have today. But so think how bad that Saxon church was.
Yeah, I do get a lot of this going through especially Victorian weapon studies,
Hmm.
Victorian anthropology, because most of the peer writing would be saying, and yeah, the swords we have now are the evolution of the other swords, which were. It's basically where the thing about long swords and broadswords being heavy and clunky and useless comes
Hmm.
from. It's like, nope, we're at the top of the pile. Everything else that came before us was crap.
Yeah, and you know I blame the Victorians for so much.
Oh yeah, no kidding. Yeah, they did quite a few things.
But I mean, like you think about all of those depictions of Vikings with horns,
Yeah,
horns on their helmets, or wing. I've seen ones with gigantic wings on their helmets. Or if you go back and you see Fritz Lang's films, the Nibelungen, the Burgundians, who again are supposed to be one of these barbarian tribes. They've it's great. My favorite character in them is this guy named Hakon, who is kind of an Odin analogy in a way, although he's human. But anyway, yeah, he's got like wings on his helmet that are I don't even know how big they are. And the idea of going into battle with the horns or the wings or anything like that, and this is where it gets very strange. Okay, so the idea of doing that is, I think, you know, look, you would never do that in real life.
for
Uh,
sure. Yeah,
if somebody's coming at you, you don't want to give them a handle. It makes your silhouette larger. If somebody's swinging an axe at you, do you really want him to, miss your head but hit that horn?
yeah, it's still going to knock you over.
You know, yeah, he's gonna jam the rim of the helmet into the side into your temple, or blind you when it comes down to whatever. It's ridiculous. And as anybody who's been in the field, and I mean not just military, but if you just do a lot of backpacking, simpler is better. The more
Yep.
ornate crap you have to carry around, the worse it is for you. Um, so, but those are Victorian illustrations, and like, why would anybody do that? I say that, but then if you ever see some of the reenactments of medieval jousts, you will sometimes see knights wearing like a regular, basket helm,
And
right?
then
But
an
then like
ornament on
there's
top.
a
Yeah,
bunch of crap going on up here as well.
yeah, but that's
But the
part of the
thing is,
sport of
that's not
jousting.
actual combat.
Yeah, exactly. That's part of the sport of
Yeah,
jousting. It has nothing to do with actual lance
it's
combat.
ritualized.
Yeah,
It's why you put on your ermine robe to go to a coronation if you're an earl. You know, it's not a real thing.
yeah,
If
exactly.
those guys are like, oh, well, we're going to have this joust today, so I got to put on the really fancy stuff. But tomorrow morning it's Agincourt, so I got to be ready for 25,000 Frenchmen. Tomorrow morning you look completely different than you did
Oh yeah,
the
for
day
sure,
before.
for sure.
Yeah. But again, if you find a complete set of fancy armor, okay, you're going to go, look, this is what they were wearing.
Oh yeah,
Well, they
absolutely.
were once, and it doesn't help anyway, because think about how many kings got killed by lances splintering and going right through their eye.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Yeah, but that's a different thing. The interpretation of armor is there have been some very strange things going on.
Yeah.
I mean, just going by the things that have been reconstructed over the last 30 years, it's like, the hell were you guys doing? Okay, let's see here. Dungeon Matron, it's weird to hear this in stereo. I can hear him talking on my laptop and also from the other room.
That's what she needs. She needs to hear me twice.
It's a feature.
Yeah.
Okay, also Dungeon Matron, so their cages translates into not much information to go on ages.
That's really it. I mean, it's not only that. That's where it starts. That's sort of the justification that a historian might use to say, well, it's okay if you call it the Dark Ages. It's not really dark, but we don't know much. There isn't a lot of evidence. But again, they're playing to the crowd, right? It's like,
Yeah,
but you've got evidence. We're not saying you're correct. Could you at least take a stand on what was going on rather than using it as an excuse?
Okay, so it's more like the we're going to put all this stuff under the carpet and we're not going to talk about it ages.
Yeah, we're fine. Well, yeah, and again, they've been called on it so many times now that uh, you tend to get uh, the term early Middle Ages. Just, but again, if you say early Middle Ages, maybe you're not saying Dark Ages, but you are still going with the whole Middle Ages thing, which stemmed from the use of the term Dark Age.
Which is still
So
defining it based on what it isn't rather than on what it is. Okay, I
exactly,
get you. Okay,
exactly,
that makes total
and
sense.
implying that it's worse. You know,
Okay, I get you.
so you're backing into it instead of being straight out. No, I think it was Dark Ages. Everybody died young, and it was terrible. At least somebody who says that is being honest, and they're right for a lot of places. Um, but they are ignoring a lot of places where that's
Okay, oh, this is interesting. Dungeon Matron says, Thomas talk about the theory of urinals. Oh, I have to hear this.
not. Oh God. Okay, I will. So, kind of ties back to the whole King Tut thing, which is people don't realize how dependent archaeologists are on written. I was going to say documentation, but I mean that very broadly.
Sorry,
Right?
did you say archaeologists or theologists? I missed that part.
Archaeologists.
Archaeologists, okay, okay.
Yeah. So why do we know anything about I won't say why do we know anything, but if it wasn't for baked clay tablets, we wouldn't have the Epic of Gilgamesh. It
Mm-hmm.
isn't like an archaeologist dug up a building that told us that. He dug up an archive of clay tablets. Okay, so archaeologists use writing for a variety of different reasons. One is they simply compare the facts, the implications in the writing to what they found on the ground. So they have a broader spectrum of
Mm-hmm.
evidence. Sometimes, like the somewhat infamous Heinrich Schliemann, you go, I bet Homer is right, and there really is a Troy. I'm going to go destroy it.
With dynamite,
I mean,
yes.
yeah, it's sort of the classic, to save the village, they had to destroy it kind of thing. Um, to because he's Schliemann, terrible person that he was, is one of the reasons that there is archaeology. But he sort of got us there by digging straight through Troy,
With
just
explosives, yeah.
excavating the crap out of it. So, there's archaeologists use it for a variety of reasons. So there is, and as I said, when they went into King Tut's tomb, they wanted to find writing saying, "Hi, I'm the son of Akhenaten," or "Hi, Uh, technically, I'm the son of Akhenaten, but he was just heretic, so I can't really say that. They did find things that actually told them that, like childhood toys of his that had his name spelled Tutankhaten.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But then when he became pharaoh, Tutankhamen. So so they're able to figure it out. But there is a short story by an American science fiction writer named Randall Garrett, who if you ever want to read something kind of fun, you should read his Lord Darcy series. It's set in an alternate universe where the laws of magic were codified in the 14th century, and it's a series of short stories about this. Oh, and also the Angevin Empire never fell.
Okay. Lord Darcy, you said?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm
So the
going
guy's
to
name
take it.
is Randall Garrett. I'm actually staring at it right here. I realize that doesn't necessarily help, but
Hang on.
so anyway, Lord Darcy is the chief forensic investigator for the Duke of Normandy. But he has a sorcerer sidekick who is a forensic sorcerer. Anyway, they're lots of fun. But uh, Garrett wrote a short story, and I can't remember the title of it, but it is about archaeologists 10,000 years in the future who return to Earth, which is a ruined world, not apocalyptic necessarily, but humanity has moved on. And they're digging through rubble. And they find they're in a room. They dig down. They find a an artifact, decent size. They don't know what it's for. It seems like it has room for ingress and egress. It's a ceramic. They don't know. They start speculating, and the end of the story is that they catalog it. They walk away. They don't know what it is. They say future scholars will have to figure this out, and then it goes back and describes it, and it's clearly a urinal. Or if you're English, a urinal. But it just says it has the word standard on it. So we know what it is. The archaeologists don't know what it is. So that's why even if you find artifacts, it doesn't necessarily tell you anything. You know, so I don't think I have the patience to be an archaeologist. It's tough enough being a historian.
Yeah, I think we sometimes we do have discussions about what would archaeologists say if they found our crafting stations 2,000 years into the future.
Well, you know, chances are they would think that you were building a spacecraft or something, because, and this is something the dungeon matron said to me today. She used the word romantic, but I understand what she's getting, which is you get a piece of evidence, you make the most of it. And especially in the so-called Dark Ages, there isn't a whole lot of evidence, right? So what you get, you tend to make a big deal. You know, so yes, if somebody comes around and goes, "Hey, look, what is this? It says Dremel on it. What does it do? I don't know." Sure, why wouldn't they say, "Look, he's making a home spaceship"? Why not?
Okay, let's see. Dungeon Minister, I like to consider myself late middle-aged rather than just old. Yep, that's fair. That's a good use of the classification.
I think you're experiencing the Renaissance, because that's what comes after middle age,
And campaign.
as opposed to the term second childhood. You know?
Yeah, good point. Yeah. And campaigner is saying my favorite clay tablet archive is the records kept by Ea Nazir. That's the copper merchant one, I believe. The one with the complaints about the quality of copper.
Right. I guess one other thing that to point out is we talked about Dark Ages, and well, people are sort of defining themselves and going, "Oh, that was bad, which makes me good," right?
Mhm.
But at the same time, think about it. The actual opposite of a Dark Age is a Golden Age, which is also a term that's used a lot.
Okay.
But that has the same kind of issues, right?
Pretty much. Yeah.
So, you know, we talk about the Golden Age of Greece. Everybody knows, oh, that's classical Greece, and it's this, and this, right? But if you were to, for example, ask Thomas Jefferson, name a Golden Age, what would he say? Would he say classical civilization? Would he say Rome? Probably not. Probably the first place he would go would be Anglo-Saxon England. Which ironically is, of course, right in the middle of the Dark Ages. But he would look at it and say, no, he'd be wrong in a lot of cases. I don't know that he'd say representative government, but he would say it was a pseudo-democracy, something like that. He would say, it protected the rights of the individual. By the way, this is mostly BS, but this is what he would say. But again, it just goes to show that, I mean, these terms don't have to rely on actual data in a sense. But his calling that a golden age is part of sort of the larger. There was a whole school of thought that talked about Germanic law,
Okay.
being the basis of a fundamentally democratic society. And this is a very weird thing, and it morphed over the years, but it goes back to Roman writers who talked about the fact that, for instance, the various tribes that would have been German or in Germany at that period didn't have a king, but that in times of trouble, they would elect a war leader, who would lead them through this conflict, and then he would retire at
Okay.
the end. So it was seen as, again, relatively democratic. Well, where do the Angles and the Saxons come from? They come from Germany, right?
Yeah.
So by definition, I won't say by definition, the logic is Germanic peoples are more democratic.
Okay.
So I mean, it ended up becoming a sort of a cultural / racial view of democracy.
So it's
So
basically one of those towers of suppositions piled on top of each other.
yes,
All right.
exactly. It's like, oh, well, once you accept this, now you have to accept that. And, eventually you're at the point where, people like Jefferson is not the only person by any means, see the Norman conquest as just a horribly bad thing because it created a strict class system
Mm-hmm.
where the ruling class was differentiated by dress, language, administration, title, everything. Which, by the way, is actually true. Where the whole thing falls apart is that they claimed that what was in place in Anglo-Saxon England before the Norman conquest was democratic.
Hmm.
It's just not true. Maybe primogeniture is not something in Anglo-Saxon England, but the king is always to be chosen from the royal family. Okay, so if someone is an atheling, you are a prince of the royal line and you can become king if the Witan, the Great Council, elects you. Okay, but by the way, who's the Great Council? It's not like Joe Farmer in Somerset is electing somebody to the Great Council or anything like that. So in order to make the Norman conquest look worse and to make the previous period look better in terms of land tenure and blah blah blah, you ignore all the bad stuff. You know,
Okay.
it's the same kind of thing. Accentuate the good, minimize the bad, and that held on well into the early 20th century. I mean, it was revived by the Victorians and lived on, well, probably till at least the First World War.
So
But that's a golden age by somebody's definition,
yeah, but
not
again,
a dark age by others.
I mean, both of them are so it's not even subjective, but it's a golden age if you approve of what you think. What was what was going on there? You're approving of what you think was going on there at the time.
Right. Right. And I mean,
And
it seems pretty
same with
obvious
Dark
to
Ages,
somebody
yeah.
like Jefferson that there's a political slant to this, right?
Hmm.
He was a political animal, right? So he wants to see this. His brain is sort of trained to see that element of Anglo-Saxon England. Um, don't ever let anybody tell you that historians are objective, because they're not. Even if they try to be, they can't be, because they're people. They have opinions. They have points to make. They have tenure to get. They have books to sell. And I used to tell my mother this, and she would get very, very upset with me. I would say, history is fiction. And she would say, well, it's not made up. And I said, no, it's not made up, but everybody chooses what to leave out. And partially that's an editor's request, because who wants a 40,000 page book? But also the things that you tend to leave out are the things that you don't think are important.
It's either that, or if you're a scribe writing for your king, there are some things you might want to leave out so you don't get decapitated or things like that. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a reason that Alfred the Great is called the Great, right? So he's the only English king who's got the Great after his name. Well, he was very smart and had somebody write his autobiography essentially when he was alive. If you want good press, You control the press.
Yeah.
It's that simple. I mean, he had a friend write it. He was also a friend, a legit friend. But yeah, have your friend write it. Have it happen during your lifetime when you hold the power of life and death. You'll probably end up with a pretty nice appreciation.
Yeah, good 5-star review kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have any other particular topics about or pet peeves about the Dark Ages or things that you're really passionate or really angry about kind of thing?
Um, I guess it's the fact that once these things get locked in, they're so hard to overcome. And this is not specific to things like the Dark Ages. Um, but I understand why historians feel the need to apply these sort of periods. But the problem is that historians probably think too much about them, and the public probably thinks too little about them. But nobody's really aware of the gulf between those two perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
So one of popular culture tends to say things like the 20th century, the 19th century, the 18th century, right? So those are essentially numbers, right? But if you ask a historian of those period, there isn't a single century that starts at 1900, 1800, 1700. And so if you ask a historian about the 19th century, that century will actually, for historical reasons, as opposed to mathematical reasons, start in 1815 and end in 1914.
Kind of between two historical landmarks kind of thing?
Yes,
Okay.
between two different, how shall I put it? The system changed, okay? 1815, Congress of Vienna,
Okay, all right, yeah.
okay? 1914, the system that was at least sort of put into place by the Congress of Vienna and then morphed over the next century comes to an end in 1914 with the
I
outbreak of
got
the
you.
First.
I see. The Dungeon Minister put down two quotes here, which are really good for this.
Yeah,
So,
no, these generalizations that don't help, right? you know, yeah,
historic ages are like generation labels. Oh, you're a boomer. You must be like this. Yeah, pretty much.
exactly right. I mean, this is the downfall of shorthand, right? It's handy, but does it mean what you think it means? You know what you think it means. When you say it to somebody, do they? Um, when did the 20th century start? This is where it gets really weird. I would say it started in 1918, which is a very strange thing to say because that means there's 4 years in there where apparently time didn't exist. That's 1914 to 1918. Okay. So we didn't know what was going to come out of it. What if Germany had actually broken through? I don't know what you would have. Would you then end up with a Cold War between a German dominated Europe and the United States? I don't know, maybe. It's an interesting thing to think about. But basically when you move from system to system, it never happens like this. And that's one of the problems, like I said, with the fall of Rome. Oh, last Roman emperor in the West, 476. Now we're in the Dark Ages. But it hardly ever occurs like that.
Yeah,
So
that reminds me. I think the news took 30 years to reach some parts of the empire, like hey, the emperor died, and it was like, oh, okay, when?
mhm,
30 years ago.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean it takes time. And again, I mean, if you what so if you start the 20th century in 1918, it would actually probably be better to start it in 1919 because that's when you have the Treaty of Versailles and things like that. When does it end? Does it end in 1991
Why
with the
91?
fall of the Soviet Union? So is that a really short century as opposed to the 19th century, which is almost 100 years, but not 1800 to 1900?
Oh,
So it's these kinds of historical, you know, terms, but it's more general. It's just a label that you're putting. Can be really misleading and confusing.
Yeah, and I'm guessing if you have different specializations, like for example, an industrial historian versus a social historian or fashion historian or whatever, they're going to have two different meanings for the same terms.
Absolutely. And again, it can be. It doesn't have to be even that. It's sort of as we talked about with the Renaissance, starting at different places and different times. The I mean, if you talk about the Industrial Revolution in England,
Hmm?
it starts a long time before it starts in the United States.
Fair, yeah.
You know, um, so you're in the same discipline. You're talking about primarily the same processes, but you're off by at least 50 years. You know, so this is frankly this is why historians have a profession, is that they can get really noodly about things like that. You know, that it's sort of an infinite thing. You can just keep going. Okay, well, that last guy looked at 10 years. I'm going to look at 5 years because I know that there are exceptions to what he said occurred over the 10 years, and I'm going to focus on those and write a 400-page dissertation on that. And when I publish my dissertation, I will be the world's foremost authority on those 5 years. I mean, that'll only last until the next guy does it, but still, at one point, you are the guy, because that's the way the historical profession works.
All right. Yeah, I guess it's like you said earlier. It's like you've got this block of potential facts, and then you start chipping at it and subdividing until you do have something resembling the truth. That
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, it's kind of depressing if you think about it.
Is it? What?
You have to be into the details to some degree to understand it, but the more you get into those details, the more you understand that speaking about broad collectivities is a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, but again, at the same time, I think that broad collectivities are always a starting point. I don't think you should
Well, they're
think
the
in terms
easiest
of.
way to they're the easiest way to communicate something. If after all, look, when most people write so-called popular histories,
Mhm.
they aren't really trying to get the details over. They're trying to get, as somebody said in here, the zeitgeist of the period over. That's really what they're trying to get across. But it's, again, because it's a historian writing it, they aren't necessary. It's the zeitgeist of the period as informed by their own zeitgeist. You know, if you're writing about totalitarianism in 1940 as opposed to 1950, you're going to write a radically different book.
Okay, I get the feeling that you can also get people writing about totalitarianism in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a very weird thing, and it almost drove me nuts when I was doing my dissertation, which is uh, I would watch the very same person change their opinion of something over and over again. And this would be in letters. So it wouldn't, it's not like I'm reading between the lines. They would actually change their ideas.
So it's something that happens over the course
And
of months, I guess, yeah? Or years, even.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Or especially if they're writing to somebody. Like, there's a famous exchange of letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, which, they ended up not speaking to each other for like a decade for political reasons. And then I think it was John Adams' wife, Abigail, who said, look, you guys were really good friends. You have a lot to talk about. You should start writing again. And they did for like the last 10 years of, of Jefferson's life. And as they discussed things, their ideas changed. And one of the things that changed was they corrected each other's memories.
Ooh.
Okay. So you have Jefferson saying, this happened, and Adams saying, no, it was this. And Jefferson saying, you're full of crap. It wasn't like I was there. And Adams going, no, I was there, but I was sitting over here and I could see him do this. and Jefferson going, "Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, that changes my memory." And that goes into the writing of history, that kind of thing. That's why you should always have historical debates where, people call each other horrible names. Because suddenly it's happened to me many, many times. Suddenly I've gone, oh, I never thought of that. Because you're locked into your own way of looking at it. And Dark Ages is a perfect example. It's like, it's not really dark. Could we not call it that? I don't know what you want to call it, but could we not do that? Because that's immediately pejorative. And it's already you saying, before we get to any detail, it was crap. My period is good.
Yeah, the only thing that I can see being problematic about it is that if you want to, put up a category, books about Rome, that's easy.
Mhm.
Books about the Roman Empire, that's also easy. If you want to do the arcages a bit more accurately, it'd be like, yeah, Carolingian Empire, and then this other kingdom, and then this other kingdom, and then this other kingdom. Yeah, so it might literally be just a filing thing.
Well, it's too broad.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
that's the
really
thing.
the problem. Is it's just too broad. It doesn't help anything. If I think it's incumbent on anybody who's writing broad history, periodized history, to say, as an example, classical civilization, I don't know, 200 BC to 500 AD. Just say the dates. If you say that, I know you're not talking much about the Etruscans on one side, and I know you're not talking about the Byzantines on the other, and I know you're not talking about most of the Franks and the Visigoths and stuff like
Hmm?
that, although they are on the scene by 500. But you need to be a little more neutral, you know, in terms of where does this go on the shelf?
Yeah,
As you say, it's like you can put up Rome. Okay, it's the Rome section. Now you reader, you go through and you pick out what you want, as opposed to me telling you what.
so 1 second. Earthman Brick. Hi, Steve. War, especially cold ones, have a heavy dose of propaganda to intentionally motivate or demoralize others. Interpreting the truth can be difficult. That's why declassified military papers are useful. Ah, okay, he's answering Lisa. There must be a study on how the same history has been interpreted by different societies. The differences between Soviet and US history of the Cold War would be interesting.
Well, we're saying that today, aren't we? The current history that's being, or the current commentary, or whatever you want to call it, that's being written in Russia at the moment, uh, is, I'm not saying it's untrue, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult to sort of evaluate what the Russians are saying right now without understanding that Russia's always had this incredibly ambivalent feeling about the West. And you can look at the situation right now, for example, and say, you know, the current regime is rejecting the West. Um, okay, fine, but you go back and look at Peter the Great, where he, forced everybody to accept the West. So that idea, yes, history is written from any different perspective are going to be very different. But these are, there's a huge divide in. Okay, I'm old. I started to say Soviet culture, in Russian culture, that, in a sense, doesn't know what to think. The irony, of course, is that under the Soviet regime, the ideology of the Soviet regime is essentially a Western European construct being applied to a situation that was not Western European. So, in that sense, it didn't really contain the seeds of its own downfall. It on for longer if they did a better job of managing things. But it just seems like there's a dichotomy there. Today, this is much more of a much more specifically nationalistic, which you could at least argue that Soviet communism wasn't. You probably lose the argument, but you could make the argument. So if they're saying the West is after us, It's a very weird thing. If the West is after us, and they're all plutocrats in the West, okay, fine, I guess. But that's not really, when the first thing we do is pull all the McDonald's out, that doesn't make us any money. So obviously, we're not just driven by that. And of course, Russia is probably the greatest example of a plutocracy that exists in the world today. So people are willing, generally speaking, to subordinate the facts to the point they want to make.
Ain't that true?
Yeah. And that can change. God, who is it? There's early 16th century. So this is after Henry VII has won the Battle of Bosworth and has defeated and killed Richard III. So the very first Tudor king. And there is an account of the reign of Richard III by a guy whose name totally escapes me, that says basically he was a good king and he did good things. And that guy lived past 1485, and lo and behold, he revised it. And in, I want to say like 1505, so under Henry VII, he wrote a new book, a revision of the old one, saying Richard III was a crap king and he deserved to die. And today we would look at that and go, wow, this is a guy with like no integrity whatsoever, which kind of misses the point that you don't write things like this unless you have somebody's patronage
Yeah, for sure.
and you don't want to get executed, right? But people do change their minds, and sometimes they change them for a variety of reasons. So if you read the later account, it's totally different. And I have seen assessments of the sort of, look, did Richard III kill his nephews kind of thing. I have seen differing accounts that used either the first version that this guy wrote or the second version, depending on what point they wanted to make. Now, you can't say that it's wrong because he did write it. But you aren't giving the whole, I mean, that's a pretty pertinent fact that he then changed his mind. The argument, of course, in rebuttal is the first one is probably true because it's clear that he only wrote the second one because he didn't, want Henry VII's minions, Empson and Dudley, coming after him. That's the rebuttal. On the other hand, you could argue, look, the guy never has his own thought. He's just going to write to say, hey, you're a great king to whoever the king is. It doesn't matter. He's never had any integrity. So I don't know, which one do you pick? You can pick either one. He wrote both. And you can make any point you want with it.
Okay, no, just thinking because there are quite a few just I remember there's one for King Alfred, which, as you mentioned, is written by not only his a close friend but also someone in his employ, and
Yeah. It's Asser.
yeah, and I know there were also ones of Charlemagne. And practically, I think every king had them written.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah. There are at least two different biographies of Charlemagne that were written at the time, so that's helpful rather than just having the one. There's the sort of the
kind of
classic one that
different
everybody
angle on
reads.
it, yeah.
Yeah, the first one by Einhard, he's actually is a friend of Charlemagne, so you know what you're getting in a sense. But then the second one, which is by a monk named Notker, is at least a little different because he's writing from the point of view of the church specifically.
Okay.
So you get not like he's in opposition or anything, but it's at least a slightly different.
So you can compare them at least, kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but ultimately, of course, he loved Charlemagne because Charlemagne was a patron of the church. I mean, he's
Yeah, there's it.
the first guy crowned Holy Roman Emperor. So it's not like Notker is going to go, oh no, he was terrible. He was so terrible that Leo the Tenth crowned him on Christmas Day.
Yeah,
And
it's not
what
like
a mistake.
you would get with Frederick II, I believe. Yeah, I think there was some point where he was officially called the Antichrist or whatever.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yes. Yes. You have your choice with Frederick II. He's either the stupor mundi, the wonder of the world, or he's the Antichrist. I mean,
why not have
people
both?
act as if propaganda as a word is a relatively recent word, but that doesn't mean the concept wasn't
Yeah, but what I wanted to ask was, how does one get into how does one get any useful information if you know that the text is mostly propaganda?
Yeah, it's really tough, and like I said, if you're lucky enough to have, as in the case of Charlemagne,
Hmm?
two relatively contemporary versions with two clear viewpoints. I mean, you know where both these guys are coming from. You can at least you at least have some way to work at it. But the problem is you generally don't have that, and that's not a function of the Dark Ages. That occurs later as well. But it gets extremely strange when you get the different lives of saints, for example, where you hesitate to say, "Oh, he just made that up," because in the Middle Ages, they're not writing history. That's there aren't any academic rules or anything like
Good point.
that.
Yeah,
They are writing for a purpose, and the purpose is to say this guy was a great saint, and if that involves cutting off three giants' heads with one blow, fair enough. You know, um, it gets very difficult. This A very good example of this is actually when people have tried to pin down King Arthur,
so when they try to.
and when people have tried to sort of pin down when
Okay,
and
okay.
who was King Arthur, and it's people have been trying to do this now for a long, long time, and I think they finally got the guy who was primarily the source, but still, it's really iffy, and there's like five different uh, saints' lives that talk about the period. They all differ in terms of not just dates, but also the order of events and things like that. And all you can ever say in situations like this, where people aren't even pretending to be writing fact, because that's what they need to do, um, is say, this is what I think probably it is. This is my judgment. I'm a professional historian. This is my judgment. I'll give you the reasons why I'm going this way. But, saying I know thing,
Yeah.
you're just setting yourself up for failure, because sooner or later somebody's going to go into an intact tomb and find the writing, and it's going to be the reverse of what you said it was. It's sort of inevitable.
Yeah, but I think there's the intellectual honesty of saying, okay, this is what I think because this is the best information we have. I think that goes for pretty much everything.
Yeah, but the problem is that it isn't just the best information that you have. It's the value judgments that you make on competing information.
Yeah.
Like in a sense, with the Chapman's book that I talked about, it's the only one. That's what you've got to work from. Okay, so you're sort of bound by that. Yeah, there are things you have to interpret, but there's no competing authority.
I got you. Yeah.
But if you get some of these things where uh, there's five or six different sources, and three of them say one thing and two of them say the other, I don't know. What do you do? Do you say, oh, it's 3-2, the three wins? Or do you put them in a dark room and let them fight it out? It's can you imagine reading a history book that actually consisted of a historian detailing his reasoning between every one of these things where he has to make a value judgment? It would be excruciating
Yeah, I
to
mean,
read.
I think some of the things would be very interesting, but something like that would probably to no one studying history ever again. I mean, like people,
Yeah,
no, not
or
doing this.
you'd go, or you might say, I'm interested enough in this thing to read this couple of pages, but I'm not going to read the rest of it. No way.
Lugun is saying it would be interesting to run it all through Chat GPT.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder what would come out. It would be an interesting thing.
Or you could run it through Google Translate forward and backwards. See what you get. Yeah, like I said to my mother, the hardest thing is figuring out what to leave out. And you know, part of historical training is dedicated to saying, okay, you have a piece of information. How do you decide if it's important? And then once you've decided whether it's important or not, in a positive way, does it also have importance if you don't mention
Oh, okay, because there's that as well. Yeah.
it? Yeah, and that that is the tricky one. It's easy to decide if you have a thesis. This pushes my thesis forward. That's easy to decide. Okay. It gets trickier if you've got, three different versions of the same thing, and you have to go, well, this is the one that really says, this is the best one. But when you have something that clearly is on the other side of your team, do you put that in? Is that incumbent upon
Hmm.
you? No. It's a spot check by the person who's writing. But you never really get that in a history book, or you very, very rarely get that.
Maybe a
You know,
footnote. Sometimes you might get a footnote or something saying why it wasn't included, but yeah.
but even that, and as I've read these, you don't get why. What you get is a differing view may be found in.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, it doesn't tell you why it's different. It's in a footnote, not the text, and the text, the footnote font is tiny. Okay, so do you really want somebody to go and look?
Eh,
Not really. You know, it used to be that that people wrote an essay on sources at the end of the book, and that was actually very helpful because it told you what they had. You didn't have to keep track through footnotes or endnotes. You could actually just go, well, why didn't you look at this?
Wait, an essay on
You
sources
know?
is like when you put in your bibliography, but you put in detail.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
a
oh,
bibliographic essay. Yeah,
yeah,
and you would say, well, this is what I looked at. It's like, oh, well, that's good. I'm interested in this. I never thought of looking at that. Or you go, oh my God, you missed the single most important thing to look at.
yeah.
And then you have to make, as a reader, you have to make a decision as to whether or not they missed it or they intentionally missed it.
Oh, I get you.
So if you're not an academic, this isn't something that consumes your life. But I can tell you that everybody who gets a tenure track position is freaking out from the moment that they get it. And there have been a lot of attempts recently to sort of weaken tenure. But for 100 years, a tenure track position basically meant employment for life. It was like working for a Japanese corporation. Okay. And the deal was you taught and you pumped out publications. Okay. Which means as you have to hit the ground running because you're going to be up for review in 2 or 3 years. Sometimes they do it
Oh,
annually.
okay.
And if you're not on track to produce that first book, you may not get tenure. And within the sort of ivory towers of academia, that is all important. It is the ultimate security blanket. So they give you kind of an out in that your first book can be an adaptation of your um, of your thesis. So you can go back and you can tweak it, take it to a publisher. Their editor can look at it. They can, usually make it quite a bit shorter. Um, because when you're working on your PhD, all you're doing is you're just writing endlessly, right? So it's almost always longer than it needs to be. Every book is longer than it needs. Perfect. That's the key thing you take away. A nice monograph should be like 100 pages. It should never go long. You can't say it in 100 pages. You shouldn't. Um, but it's yeah, it's not necessarily publish or die. but it's publish or go through the rest of your academic life with the stigma attached that you couldn't get tenure. And that has an effect on your life and, of course, on your family's life, because you don't have a guaranteed source of income, you don't have job security, blah, blah, blah. So, so that, that whole idea of, I'm writing this book, I want to make this point. I know of something that is antithetical to the point I'm trying to make. I must mention it somehow. I must acknowledge its existence, but I cannot let it torpedo my thesis, because this is what's going to get me tenure. And so you put it in a footnote, you put it in a tiny little font, and you don't specify what it's about. You just, for a differing viewpoint, so vague as to be meaningless. Okay. Then you publish your book and you get tenure and everything is great. But again, it's well, you've mentioned it. Okay. Academic morality is gray, like most morality.
Yeah, I guess.
So I tend to look on people like the dude who wrote the two completely different versions of Richard III as like, well, the stakes were pretty high for him too. In a sense, it was tenure.
There's a question from Dungeon Mason earlier. Were both of those writings commissioned?
Where was
The two versions of
no,
Richard III.
no, they were not. They were not specifically commissioned. I mean, they weren't commissioned by Richard III or Henry VII, right? But they were, I think, dedicated to them, and clearly were attempts to get their fame. So the way that it worked back then was, you could commission something, but it was much more likely to be a situation where you wrote something, found a patron either before or after, and it wouldn't be the king necessarily. It might be a bishop or something like that. So a prominent person at court. And you wrote this thing, you got an okay from whoever your patron was, the Bishop of Winchester, and he said, yes, that's great. Maybe he reads it, maybe he doesn't. If he's smart, he reads it. And then you dedicate it to the king, and you have it published by somebody. And then maybe the bishop, if he's really feeling happy that day, will actually present a copy to the king. Okay. Or maybe he'll present it to one of the king's gentlemen of the bedchamber, who would then tell the king about it. Okay. So it's a bunch of favors going on. People are trading favors. Okay. And so ultimately, your hope, if you wrote this book, is that you would share in the favors. The king reads it and goes, I like the story. I like this. This paints me in a really good light. If you're Richard III, you're like, I know I'm going to kill my nephews, but I like this version of it. So yeah, I like this guy. Or if you're Henry VII, you say, wow, I really like the way this guy screwed over Richard III. My predecessor looks really bad, and that makes me look good. So I'm going to give him a minor position at court. I'm going to give him a pension of 10 marks a year. I'm going to send him a nice fat goose. It could be any one of those things, but it's done in a different situation, obviously, than we do it today. So they're not specifically commissioned in the sense that somebody says, I want you to write this. You write this for somebody to read so that they can turn around and repay you for your efforts on their behalf. And that's why you get two written completely differently for two different kings.
Yeah, I mean, there's a. I recall a bunch of texts with these plates on the front, and I believe that this happens even much later in the Renaissance and so on. dedicated for the to his grace, the bishop, of whatever, the marquis or whatever. And like, what would a bishop do with a book about I don't know, throwing people? It's like doesn't sound like a very bishoply thing to do, you know.
Right, or falconry or something like that.
Yeah, Falcon, maybe I could see that happening, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, but and that's the thing is, it's like you're saying, please, please, please notice me and do something good for me. And it doesn't necessarily mean I want you to support me for the rest of my life. It could just mean, okay, here's a good example. My son wants to marry the daughter of the Lord Mayor of London. And even though I'm a relatively wealthy merchant, he's a lot more wealthy than I am. And he's not going to look favorably upon my suit on my daughter's behalf. You, Bishop of London, if I do something and put your name in lights, basically, if I dedicate it to you and people read it because, you know, London is where most of the literary people are, do you think you could say something to the Lord Mayor of London and go, it's really okay. I think it'll be fine. He's a good, I've heard nothing but good stuff about his daughter. He's a wealthy, well-established guy. You should feel free to enter into this marriage contract. It could be something as simple as that.
Yeah,
So it's payment. It's payment. I
yeah,
will
of
give
course.
you this book and put your name up there in lights if you do me this small favor.
Think about it, pretty much like celebrity endorsements or stuff like that at that level.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same silly thing. Do I really care what an actor says about politics?
Yeah,
I mean, no more than anybody else, but no less, obviously. It's like, why do I care what your opinion
yeah, I
is?
mean,
It's no better informed than mine,
unless the actor is in
you know?
politics, yeah, yeah, that's it.
Yeah. The downside of this is that you can make a lot of efforts to get people to do you that favor. You can write the book. You can present them with, again, a nice fat goose. Here's a gift. This is nice. And now that you've accepted it, say, do you think you could, do something?
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's not a bribe
It's an exchange
because
of
the person
favors.
has the option of not doing it. I mean, you could argue you're giving a bribe, but he's not taking it. You could argue that, but this is part of the sort of personal relationship way that society works back then, right? It's there are structures, but so much of it is about people interacting within the structure. So if you say, "Here's a goose," drop a drop a word in the ear of the Lord Mayor, and the bishop's clerk looks at you and says, sniffs and goes, "I'm sorry." The bishop doesn't drop a word in anybody's ear for less than two geese. Okay, and so you go, "Is it worth it?" Yeah, okay. Here's another goose. Okay, and the bishop's clerk goes to the bishop and says, "Hey, so we got two geese out of this. You'll be eating them over the next couple of weeks, so that's kind of good. And all he wants you to do is say to the Lord Mayor, 'Hey, that's not a bad match.'" And the bishop goes, "Yeah, okay, sure, whatever." So it's more of a transaction
Yeah,
ultimately. Um, but again, you're not doing it to everybody. It's kind of more like, do me a favor, scratch my back and I'll scratch you.
yeah, I get you. I mean, it makes absolute sense. Dungeon Matron is saying, like the portraits of potential wives sent to kings. They were prettied up. I don't think I get the context of that.
Um, well, they aren't. They're created for a purpose, and they don't have to hew to fact. I
Okay,
suppose.
okay, that's it. Okay, I get the context now. Okay.
Sorry, 30 years of listening to my wife, I get what she's saying. Took me about 25, but the idea, these idealized portraits. One of the ones that's always pointed to is Hans Holbein's picture of Anne of Cleves.
Hmm?
You know, um, here, Holbein, go to Cleves and paint a picture so I can see what she looks like and bring it back. And supposedly, it's very different than the way she looked in person. And that is that that's sort of been the story. And Henry said that on occasion, like, oh, she's really ugly. No, no, you cheated me. I don't know who you painted, but it wasn't her, right? And there were even rumors going around that it was one of her ladies in waiting, and it's all sorts of stuff. And essentially, it took 500 years for somebody to come across two other pictures of her that basically say, no, that's actually what she looked like. Henry's just a 50-year-old who can't get it up, and he's trying to save face. Because by that time he's tremendously overweight. He's got a permanent running sore on his leg. She has no idea. I don't know if you guys know the story, but it's kind of fun. So when she comes across and she lands at Dover and then they're bringing her to London, he thinks it'll be funny if he goes to meet her on the way, but not tell her who he is. So he and several of his court, I'm not sure if they're masked or not, but they break into her bedroom in the middle of
As one
the night.
does.
And yeah, as one does, yes. As one does as one is Henry VIII. and sort of roughhouse and and she's just apparently sitting there under the bed covers going, what the hell is going on? And probably afraid for her life, frankly, because there's this extremely corpulent man with terrible breath jumping about in her bedroom and not so much making love, but sort of like throwing out phrases that hello, sweetling, and things like that. And she doesn't know who the hell he is. I mean, she finally gets it, but is this what you want? So she doesn't respond very well to it, and Henry apparently goes away, sort of with a bad taste in the mouth. And when they meet, he tries again, and she's like, this is my first impression. This is not the first impression you want to make. But again, the guy is not a fine figure of a man as he used to be, and apparently, so he Thomas Cromwell basically says, but you've got to marry her for the sake of this Protestant alliance. And he's like, okay, but I don't know. This doesn't seem like it's going well.
I wonder why.
And the funny thing is, he apparently gets. It's not that he doesn't like her per se. He doesn't like the way that she reacted to him. And because he's who he is, and he's not alone in this. I mean, things are like this, right? He can't allow any suspicion of weakness or a lack of manliness to sort of get out. So it can never be his fault. So at the end of the day, he says, she's ugly, she smells, she's stupid, and so I can't marry her, but I'm going to marry her anyway, but then I'm going to divorce her. And this all happens in the space of like 3 weeks. Okay.
It must have been a very confusing 3 weeks for her.
I feel very sorry for her.
Yeah,
it really is. And the denouement of this is, after all of that, he is safely divorced from her. She never goes home. She stays in England. She spends the rest of her life in England. He actually says, he proclaims that she is to be known as the king's sister, and she has precedence over all other women in the kingdom, except for his queen and his daughters. He makes her a huge, huge annuity. He gives her Hever Castle, which is where the Boleyn family, so it's literally where Anne Boleyn grew up. And she comes back to court. He apparently really likes her. She really likes him. Everything is hunky-dory. So it's kind of a weird situation where, because of the personal relationships sort of being interlaced with sort of the power structure, you have this weird combination of things where there are actually two different realities running side by side. One is Henry as King of England, one is just Henry. And one is Anne of Cleves as the queen, and one is just this foreign woman who apparently is very nice and everybody likes her. So the idea of commissioning something is part of that whole world of, we'll do this personally, but I'm doing this because you're part of the power structure. But I don't really want you to officially do something for me. I just want you to quietly drop a word in the ear of somebody. So it's a very different world than what we live in today.
Yeah. Look, politics are strange, people are strange, people politics are even stranger. But there was something you mentioned there that made me remember that humor in this period is pretty messed up as well. Because I
It
think
is.
all kinds of you know what they would call practical jokes would usually involve some pretty violent stuff, like you just mentioned. I mean,
Yeah. Well, the classic example, of course, is the Miller's Tale in Canterbury Tales.
uh,
You know, which ends up with with a poker going up somebody's ass. Now, see, we can look back at that and go, "Oh my God, really?" Because the Canterbury Tales is supposed to be this masterpiece, and again, it stands out by virtue of the fact there aren't many things like it. So we have elevated it, right? And it's good. I actually like it. It's pretty good. But I will tell you something very funny about it, because we look at this and we go, "Oh God, what is this? That's not our kind of humor." I've been to an I've been to a performance of the Canterbury Tales um, in London, and uh, probably strongest in my memory is the fact that I knocked my ice cream over the edge of the balcony onto the guy's head below.
oh
But
no!
yeah, well, yeah, that's
Did
what
you
you
get
get.
did you get more ice cream after that?
Don't sit under the balcony, folks. Um, but when they got to the Miller's Tale, and bit of stage business, obviously, but with the Miller the poker up the bum, everybody laughed at it still. Everybody laughed at it. It got the loudest laugh of anything that happened. So we aren't that far removed from medieval humor.
Yeah,
You know,
I guess we wouldn't initiate some of those things now. I hope, but yeah, it's mostly slapstick, I guess. No, I mean pretty much.
I mean, it is, most of it is, but then it was a very physical world that they were living in.
Also
That's
true. Yeah.
part of it. But I don't know. We were just remarking on this last night. If you've ever seen the British sort of panel quiz show called QI,
Hmm?
the panel is composed of comedians, but some of them are very, very smart people. And yet inevitably, I would say probably at least 80% of the jokes are about sex or poo. And
Yeah,
that
I think
suggests
that
to me
should
that
cover
things haven't
about
changed that much.
80 or
Yeah.
90% of the stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe they're not so different. Maybe it just looks weird because they don't have an idea of perspective in art or something. But
Yeah.
yeah, but you can go back and read riddles, that still work.
Oh yeah, yeah.
If you think about the Yellow Book of Riddles, the Anglo-Saxon Yellow Book of Riddles, which then feeds straight into Tolkien's riddle game between Bilbo and Gollum. This is an old thing, and obviously it goes on today because we all had to watch that scene in The Hobbit.
Yeah, I see that Earthman Brick is saying physical comedy is timeless and universal, hence why apes and monkeys love it. Do they? I didn't know they also went for that kind of thing. Also, why the Three Stooges and Sam Raimi's antics are timeless.
Well, it is. I mean, you're right. It doesn't change. It is timeless in that sense. It doesn't depend on wordplay, for example,
Hmm.
or contemporary references. If I'm watching QI, I'm going to miss a lot of, obviously, of the British uh, references. But if you remember a film called Quest for Fire from, I think, the early 80s, which is literally about a tribe of, I guess they're Cro-Magnons. Maybe they're Neanderthals. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. Point is, their fire, which they recognize as a very, very important thing for survival. Their fire goes out, and they did not know how to produce fire. They had managed to sort of cultivate this after a tree was hit by lightning. And so they go on a quest for fire. And they eventually get it. They find a tribe that does understand how to make fire, and they steal the technology and take it home. It is. It's just like today. But at one point, they're hiding. I think they're hiding in trees. They're in trees, right? And one of the guys has a rock, and he dropped. There's another guy sleeping below him, and I think he's taken these rocks up there to be projectiles in order to throw them at. Anyway, he looks down and he sees the guy below him, and he just drops it right on his head. This is a rock. It's like this size, right? And he just drops it on his head, and the guy wakes up and is, disoriented, and he's like bleeding all down his face, and he doesn't know what's going on. And so eventually he kind of comes to, and both the guy that dropped it, who is from his own tribe, which is the less advanced of the tribes, and the girl who's come along with them, who is from the more advanced tribe, are just cracking up. They think this is the funniest thing ever. And then, after it dies down, the guy up at the top drops another one on him, hits him in the head again. Now there's just blood gushing out. And now all three of them are laughing. So not only is it slapstick, not only is it, this is funny in the Stone Age, and this is totally made up, who knows, right? But it's also about the contagious quality of laughter. If somebody else is laughing, you're more likely to laugh.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
that sounds like some kind of Stone Age jackass or something like that.
I'm sure. Although in real life, they probably died.
Say again? In real life?
Yeah, if that actually happened, they probably got infected and died.
Yeah, fair enough. And I do remember a case of I forgot which king and which one, but he did give grant of land to a jester for the annual.
Well, if the guy's good,
yeah,
why not?
but the annual rent was a leap, a fart, and a whistle. Which I don't think you can get rent that cheaply these days. I mean, it's like it's a good deal.
Probably not. But he must have been very good at it. Well, you know the story of Le Petoman, don't you?
Yeah.
He was the 19th century French vaudeville.
Oh yeah, it's another good point because people did pay good money to watch that guy. Yeah?
Made a living at it. I'm like, that's impressive. That's that's internal control and diet and a whole bunch of other things. You got to work at your craft. No less than that jester did.
Yeah, for sure. Excuse me. Dungeon Matron, Rachel Welch in a fairy bikini wasn't accurate history.
Yeah. I just always think she must have been cold. That's all. Good to look at, but cold. Also, I just want you to think about what those garments, generally speaking, would have smelled.
And then
if you're running around in 10,000 BC and you're wearing furs, and you've probably tanned, you must have tanned them to some degree, but it's not like it's an industrial process. And maybe it's winter, so you're smearing some kind of animal fat on you to insulate you, and it's getting on the fur, and you're not washing it. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
So don't be Rachel Welch looked good, but don't be downwind, is what I'm saying.
Okay, so we're over 2 hours here. I think I should probably let you go into lunch or whatever.
Yeah, I got an hour before a D&D game.
Oh yeah. So it'll give you
some. So anyway, I guess the takeaway from the Dark Ages is don't believe it. Essentially, you can assign whatever value you want to it, but don't let it obscure the fact that people were doing all sorts of things during this period that aren't dark at all.
All sorts of really interesting things, I have to say.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so Tom, thank thank you again so much for joining us today. This was really good fun. I hope we'll
Thanks
see
for having
you
me, Karl. It's
anytime.
I love it when we just go all over the place. That's the best thing.
Oh yeah. No, I really enjoyed this, and I hope you can join us again in a few weeks, maybe in a couple of months, whenever you
All
feel up
right.
to it. You can pick the
Okay.
subject. I am happy to talk about anything here.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see if we can come up with something else. And if anybody wants to suggest something, that'd be great too.
Oh yeah, I mean, if there's anything, just drop it in the Discord. And speaking of which, let me grab a link here. Okay, here's a link to Dungeon Matrix Discord, where you can talk about fair bikinis and suggest other topics for the stream. Okay,
Great.
so Thomas, thanks again. We will not. I will not be streaming next Sunday because I will be busy getting beaten up in a workshop. But I will be around the week after that with Mia Gig. So thank you again, everyone, for watching, and thanks, Tom, and good night.
Thanks, Karl.
Thanks and bye.